Alright, what's up? I wanted to make a quick video today kind of covering the basics of a Proffieboard version 2. So I'm going to kind of cover what all the pins do based on what kind of saber setup you're going to make, depending on how basic or advanced it might be. I'll start with the basics of each kind of setup, whether that's Neopixel or Cree, and then I'll go on to the more advanced stuff like the OLED screens or anything like that. I'm going to be referencing the board with the USB port facing up. So if you're looking at your board from SD card up, then flip it over and you'll get a accurate representation of what I'm showing here. So the most basic pins you need to worry about are this one right here, which is battery positive, and this one right here, which is battery negative. There is another one on the other side, so you can kind of use that one too. That's this one here. But I tend to use this one and this one because they're close to each other. You'll notice there's a little solder bridge here. Let's ignore that for now. There's another ground pin just next to that, but we'll get to that later. So the next most basic pins you need to worry about are these two over here. So this one and this one. And those are the speaker pins. So the top one is speaker positive, and the one underneath it is the speaker negative. And what I've found is it doesn't actually tend to matter if you wire it backwards. It will still work completely fine because it's just carrying the speaker current. So with a lot of speakers these days, you'll be able to tell which side is the positive because it has a little red mark on it, like this one does. It might also just have a straight up positive thing in the plastic next to one of the connections on the side. So this is the positive connection on this speaker. So you'd wire that to this positive connector right here, and then the negative obviously to the other side. But as I've said, it doesn't really matter which way round you wire it. If you wire it backwards, the only thing that will happen is that the waveform that you send to the speaker will be phase inverted. So basically just flipped upside down. It will sound the same until you start adding multiple speakers, if you ever need to do that. So the next pins to worry about are the ones in the very corner here. So this one here, the exact one on the opposite side, and another one just below the speaker pins that I just mentioned here. So this one here is the button 1 pin, which you'd usually use for igniting the saber or turning on a music track or doing anything like that, depending on what prop file you use. The one on the other side is the auxiliary button, which you'd use for font changing or blaster blocks or anything like that. Button 3 is down here, which is technically auxiliary 2. People don't tend to use that one. If you really need a 3-button setup and you want your saber to do something completely different, then you can use that one too, but let's ignore that one for now. So the way you'd wire the button up is you'd have a wire coming from either of the button pins like that. You'd have it go out to your button, and then on another one of the button pins, you'd have it come back, and then you'd have it connect to any of the ground pins, which are this one here, which as I said is in a bridge with the battery negative. You can also wire it directly into the battery negative pin as well, same with the one on the other side, and I believe that's the only places that you can wire back a button. So you've got 4 pins to work with there, so you've got more than enough space. So the next pins to think about are, they're kind of in a group of 6, so it's this one right here, this one second from the top, these 2 right here, these 2 right here, and then this one right here, also 2 from the top. And those are your LED pins. So what we've got is we've got this one right here is LED 1, this is LED 2, this is LED 3, 4, 5, and 6. And the reason you need to know that is because in your config file, you need to address which of those pins are being used. So as you can see here, I've soldered something to the LED pin 1 here. So in my config file, I have a defined blade that has this pin number 1 as my power input for what I was controlling. So just an extra part of the LED section of this video. These 3 black chips right here, it's worth knowing these are the MOSFETs. There's 3 on the other side for 6 total, and they control the 6 pins here. So if you ever notice that one of these, or one on the other side, completely blows and has a little burn mark in the middle, you can just rewire from one of the pins, one of the LED pins. You can just wire it to one of the other pins, and as long as you redefine it in your config file, then you'll be absolutely fine. What a MOSFET essentially is, if you don't know, is basically a PCB controlled switch. Well, it's kind of a variable switch really. So these decide the amount of power that goes through these pins here to your LED. I just thought it'd be worth knowing what these 6 chips actually do. Anyway, back to what I was saying. So the way you'd wire up these LED pins for Neopixel is you'd have your negative line coming from your Neopixel connector or straight from the LED strip to usually 2 of the LED pins. So what I tend to do is I tend to bridge either 2 and 3 or 4 and 5, for example, and then wire a 22 gauge wire into one of these 2 pins. And then, as I said, just bridge them. So basically the current from the biggest LED strip in the whole build is being handled by 2 MOSFETs rather than just 1. Because if you overload a MOSFET, for example, then it will blow and it will not be a pleasant smell or sight. I found that out the hard way. So anyway, so wiring a Neopixel Blade in, you'd usually wire it to 2 of the pins just to take a little bit of the load off just one of the MOSFETs. You can just kind of split it between the 2. Doesn't really matter if you use 1 and 2, 1 and 5, as long as you define it in your config file and set it as a WS28X, 281X blade, then you'll be fine. So obviously in a Neopixel line, there is 3 connections. There's your negative, there's your data, and your positive. So the positive from the blade connector PCB or the actual Neopixel strip will go straight back to the positive of your battery. And if there's ever a switch, then I'll wire it separate from that LED line. So that'll come straight from the battery to the board with the switch in the middle of it, ignoring any positives from the Neopixel line. Or actually what you can do is you can wire all the positives to your positive pins of your Neopixel connector. I've seen that done quite a few times. It's a much neater way of doing it. It's kind of up to you if you guys want to bridge them and have them go back to the battery, or go the neater option, but more expensive option, and route them into your Neopixel connector. So obviously, as I said, with Neopixel, there's the negative, which we've handled with those MOSFETs. The positive goes back to the battery, not through the switch. You don't want all of the current to go through the switch, because if you turn the Proffieboard off, then the blade will go off anyway. So obviously, we've now got to worry about the data line. And what you can do, if you've got just one Neopixel thing in your whole build, then that makes this a lot easier. And what you can do is you can wire the data line, usually with a 30 or 32 gauge wire. You can wire it to this 3rd pin from the bottom here, and that is your data 1 pin. And then if you define that as part of your blade, then all of the Neopixel data will come out that pin and go straight up the blade, and it will look exactly what you want it to. So that's kind of the absolute basics for a Neopixel build. So for wiring up a Cree LED, I see a lot of people using the LED 1, 2, and 3 pins. You kind of wire the 3 pins respectively up to a resistor that needs to be calculated depending on what LED you're using. So it might be 1 ohm, 0 ohms, or 0.24 ohms, or anything like that as an example. You kind of need to calculate that depending on what your LED is. And then you wire from that resistor, after you've come out of the 3 LED pads, you wire that up to the negative connections on your Cree. So the Cree will have these 3 positive connections on it. You bridge those together, and then one long line of positive straight back down to your battery. As I said, like with the Neopixel, I would just wire it straight back to the battery, bypass the switch. As I said, if you turn the switch off, the Proffieboard goes off, which will turn the LED off anyway. So obviously with Cree, there's no data to worry about, so this data pin will probably never be used if you're not using Neopixel. But yeah, that kind of covers the Cree. Quad Cree, similar example, you just use 4 pins instead. I would actually suggest using the 4 pins along the top. Kind of makes the whole thing a little bit neater, but as I said, it doesn't really matter. As long as you define which pins you're using in your config file in the blade section at the bottom, then that'll be everything you need to know to get a Cree blade working. So that basically covers all of the most simple setups for using the pins on a Proffieboard. And what I wanted to do now was kind of cover some other examples of how you'd use the rest of the pins, giving an example of what each one does, and then after that I'll get to the kind of extra pins that don't get used very often, but they're there anyway. So let's say you wanted to wire up an OLED screen to your Proffieboard. So you wire up the negative to the ground pin here, or any of the other ground pins. I imagine you can still use this one. So you'd wire up the positive connection of the OLED to this pin in the very bottom corner down here, which is the SD power pin. That's what it's technically called anyway. It doesn't actually power the SD card slot, I believe anyway. But this pin is used as a FET control 3.3 volt, different from the 3.3 volt pin over on this side, which I'll get to in a moment. So the other pins you need to worry about on the OLED are this 1/3 from the bottom here, which is the SCL pin. That SCL pin gets wired to the SCL pin on your OLED screen. It's the same story over here. This pin right here, kind of near the middle, is the SDA pin, which gets wired to the SDA port on your OLED screen. And that will basically be all you need for the OLED screen. All you need beyond that is to define it in the config file with define enable SSD 1306, I believe. You can read up on that in the manual if you need any more help with that. So similarly to the way I just mentioned that you can wire up an OLED screen, you kind of do the Bluetooth module in the same way. So the way I've wired up a Bluetooth module before is hooking up the ground pin of the Bluetooth module to either the ground pin here, or the ground pin there, or the battery negative. You can do it in either way, realistically. But I tend to keep it on this ground pin. That kind of keeps it separate from the rest of the pins up there. And then you'd use the 3.3 volt pin going to an external switch so that you can turn the Bluetooth module off when you're not using it. And a way you can get around using a switch is if you hook up the negative line to one of the LED pins up here, and then control the power going to it kind of as a one-stage LED. Then you can kind of control the power going to the Bluetooth module, and then you add that as a separate style in your config. That's kind of complicated. I'll leave a link to where you can find that in the manual in the description. But then what you'd do past there is you'd add a capacitor between the the ground pin here and the 3.3 volt pin here. I usually do it on the underside so it doesn't hit anything when I'm putting the Saber together. So the part that's really confusing about wiring up a Bluetooth module is the Bluetooth module itself usually has a TX and an RX pin actually on the module itself. The TX pin on the Bluetooth module goes to the RX pin on the Proffieboard, and the RX pin on the Bluetooth module goes to the TX pin of the Proffieboard. So the T and the R stand for transmit and receive. So kind of think of the wire as transmitting and receiving data depending on what way you're going. So you kind of want to transmit to a receive. You don't want to transmit to a transmit. I've done that in the past and it didn't work. I wondered why, and this is why. So both ways around, you want to wire TX to RX, and then TX of the Bluetooth to RX on the Proffieboard. But the part you need to actually get it to work is in the firmware that you flash onto your Proffieboard. With all the defines at the top of your config file, you need to add define, enable serial, give it a passcode and a name. I haven't actually found that those work, but just do it anyway. It's kind of a guaranteed method of making it work. So the next thing I wanted to go over is multiple Neopixel lines. And I've seen this be a bit of a confusing topic for some people because people tend to wire up resistors in all the wrong places or not at all, and it just gets a bit too much to handle. So what I wanted to cover is where the data lines actually are, how to wire up the resistors, and yeah, let's go forward with that. So when wiring up a Neopixel data line to any kind of microprocessor, you always want to add a 470 ohm resistor, whether that's SMD or through-hole or any other type of standalone resistor. But on the Proffieboard, if you wire up a Neopixel line to data 1, there is actually already a 470 ohm resistor on the board, which is why you're able to just take a data line out of there and not have a resistor. However, if you want to wire up any extra Neopixel lines that are completely separate, then you need to add a resistor. So ignoring data 1, you always need to add a 470 ohm data resistor coming out of either data 2, which is the second one from the bottom over here, data 3, which is kind of 2 under the speaker connector, so it's this one right here, that's data 3. And then data 4 is this one right here in the very bottom corner. And the reason you add that is it's kind of a protection circuit, I believe. So wiring up a, let's say, secondary Neopixel line, for example, let's say you've got your first Neopixel line hooked up to LED pin 2 and 3, and it's also hooked up to data 1, also coming back to the positive on the battery. The positive will either go back to the positive bridge on the Neopixel connector or back to the battery, also bypassing the switch because you don't want LED current going through the switch. That would be confusing. So wire that back in, let's say to LED 1, and then the data line, we need to wire that into a 470 ohm resistor, heat shrink that so it's all insulated, and then that data line comes all the way around and back over to data 2 over here. And then in the config file, we would then define that as a separate blade and add a new blade style in every single preset to define what happens with those accent LEDs. Same goes for data 3 or data 4 down here. You just need to wire the positives together, either using the Neopixel connector, as I said, or back to the battery. So with any of the Neopixel negatives, you pretty much always wire them back to any of these 6 LED pins. It doesn't really matter which one. As I said, just define them in your config file. And what I tend to do as well is I tend to note down which segment of my Saber build is hooked up to which pins so that I can easily define it in the config file later. So yeah, that covers the data pins. So a few final thoughts on the rest of the pins on the board. I've seen a lot of people do this. You wouldn't believe that people have actually done this, but they have. So there is a 5-volt pin right here, which I've seen a lot of people take as that's where the positive for the battery goes, and that is absolutely not where the positive from the battery goes. This 5-volt pin is 5 volts that is generated by the Proffieboard, usually when sound is running. So 5 volts comes out of here. You don't want to put any voltage into here. That's the complete wrong way to do it. Your voltage goes in here at battery positive and here at battery negative. You do not want to use that 5-volt pin to power the Proffieboard. So the other pin I want to mention is this pin right here, which is the reset pin, which I believe if you hook that up to a button, kind of the same way that you do a button up here with one of the corner pins, and then hook that back around to a ground like this one, I believe if you press that, it then has the same effect as pressing this reset button. I've not had to use that for any of my builds, but it's there in case you need it. So final 2 pins that I don't think you'll ever use are the SWD IO pins and the SWD clock pins right here. And those 2 are often used for debugging. I've not actually seen them used in a Saber build ever, but it's worth knowing those are used for debugging. Just kind of avoid those pins unless you're specifically debugging your Proffieboard. So there you go. That basically covers all of the pins. There's a whole bunch more things that you can do with the Proffieboard. I believe it's the most, well, it is the most open source Lightsaber soundboard out there on the market right now. Thank you to Frederick for making this happen. It's a great board. If you want to read up more on what you can do with the Proffieboard, as I said, I'll leave the link to the manual in the description below. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope this was useful. I thought you guys would prefer this in video form because I know some of you guys would find it easier to follow rather than just looking through the manual, not exactly knowing what you're looking for. But yeah, there you go. That is what you need to know about the basics of Proffieboard. Thanks everyone for watching, and I will see you in the next video.